On behalf of the law school and my faculty colleagues, I want to welcome you to the 10th Annual Legal Ethics and Professionalism Symposium. As many of you know, this annual event, which rotates between UGA, Mercer, Emory, and Georgia State, is made possible through an endowment created by a consent decree that was entered by the Honorable Hugh Lawson of the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Georgia. That decree settled allegations of litigation misconduct in exchange for a substantial financial contribution that helps fund the annual symposia as well as academic chairs at each of the Georgia law schools that are dedicated to ethics and professionalism. We are all thankful for Judge Lawson's and the parties' creative resolution of that case. In the past, the respective Georgia law schools have addressed a wide variety of topics important to the legal profession, such as ethics in settlement negotiations, problems in discovery and professionalism, teaching ethics and professionalism, taking your case to the court of public opinion, and most recently, ethics and professionalism in the digital age. This year, we have decided to focus on the difficult issue of drawing the ethical line in the context of high-profile or controversial cases. While such line drawing certainly occurs in any type of legal representation, the stakes involved and the issues presented when a client or matter is particularly notorious, condemnable, or contentious render the exercise far more complex. Take, for example, the decision to represent a given client. Usually a lawyer's concerns will principally relate to whether or not there is a conflict of interest and how to structure the fee arrangement. This rather routine calculus can change dramatically, however, when the prospective client is Saddam Hussein or John Walker Lynn. While we have an ethical rule, Rule 1.2b, which proclaims that a lawyer's representation of a client, including representation by appointment, does not constitute an endorsement of the client's political, economic, social, or moral views or activities, this seems like wishful thinking at best. And most attorneys realistically must consider what effect representing a vilified or infamous client will have on their law practice or that of their firm. Although in hindsight we may come to view a lawyer who chooses to undertake this type of case as a heroic modern-day Atticus Finch, that by no means alleviates the contemporary concerns and difficulties associated with taking on such a controversial matter. Atticus Finch didn't hesitate to accept the representation of Tom Robinson, a black man in the Deep South in the 1930s accused of raping a white woman. But as you'll recall, his decision brought with it disturbing repercussions for both him and his family. We as lawyers applaud and exalt this courageous and noble literary figure, holding him up as the ideal of what our profession should be about. However, would we, as real-life attorneys, have been so quick to embrace a condemned client like Tom Robinson under similarly volatile circumstances? Criminal defense attorneys are not the only lawyers who encounter these sorts of weighty concerns. Prosecutors, too, can face enhanced pressure in connection with the decision of when, whether, and with what crimes to charge a high-profile or controversial target. Likewise, in the civil arena, prospective clients, perhaps the manufacturer of a singularly dangerous or defective product, can be the subject of unparalleled public disdain. Once the decision to accept the representation or to bring criminal charges has been made, the ethical line drawing going forward can also present unique challenges. There are, of course, ethical limits on how far a lawyer is permitted to go in advocating on behalf of a client or in prosecuting a defendant, but are these limits likely to be stretched or exceeded in this setting? In 1820, Lord Henry Brougham, in defending Queen Caroline against a charge of adultery, famously proclaimed, "An advocate, in the discharge of his duty, knows but one person in all the world, and that person is his client. To save that client by all means and expedients, and at all hazards and costs to other persons, and amongst them to himself, is his first and only duty. And in performing this duty, he must not regard the alarm, the torments, the destruction which he may bring upon others." More recently, criminal defense attorney and law professor Abby Smith has written that no matter how personally distasteful or morally unsettling, zealous advocacy demands that criminal defense lawyers use whatever they can, including stereotypes, to defend their clients. Are these the types of line-drawn standards that should govern one's zealous representation of a criminal defendant? If so, do they have any place outside of that context, for example, with regard to prosecutors? Should lawyers in such matters be myopically fixated upon achieving their client's or the state's objective, whatever the cost? Or is there a point at which the interest of the system or the public should take priority, requiring that unbridled zeal and loyalty take a back seat? These are the types of fascinating questions that our distinguished lineup of presenters will be exploring with us throughout the day. I hope that you find the program to be engaging and educational, and I urge you to actively participate by posing questions and offering comments at appropriate times at the microphone in the back of the room. I know that we have a wealth of knowledge and experience in the audience today, and I hope that you'll be generous in sharing that with us. In terms of format, I think that the program is pretty self-explanatory, and I will leave it to each moderator to advise you on how their respective discussions are going to be structured at the time that those panels take place. My principal functions throughout the day will be to make introductions and to keep us on schedule. And with that in mind, I will now seamlessly move to the introduction of our first featured speaker, former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. After obtaining a master's degree in history and a JD from the University of Chicago in 1950, Ramsey Clark returned to his native Dallas, Texas to practice law in the family law firm Clark, Reed & Clark. After about 10 years of private practice, Mr. Clark was appointed by President John F. Kennedy as the Assistant Attorney General for the Lands Division, now known as the Environment and Natural Resources Division, and served in that capacity until 1965. Beyond his environmental-related responsibilities, Mr. Clark was integrally involved in many of the groundbreaking civil rights advancements that took place during this period, including supervising various efforts at desegregating public schools in the South, most notably the historic admission of James Meredith as the first African American to the University of Mississippi. He also played a vital role in the creation and passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson appointed Mr. Clark to the position of Deputy Attorney General, and in that capacity, he continued his strong commitment to civil rights. Among other things, he led the investigation into the infamous Watts race riots and was instrumental in securing passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 1966, Ramsey Clark became the acting Attorney General following the resignation of Nicholas Katzenbach, and he was subsequently appointed the Attorney General in 1967. In that role, in addition to his sustained efforts on the civil rights front throughout one of the most volatile periods of racial unrest in our nation's history, Mr. Clark also successfully put a freeze on the imposition of the federal death penalty, curtailed FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's pervasive domestic wiretapping practice, and was a strong advocate for federal prison reform and gun control, among many other things. Following his departure from the Justice Department, Ramsey Clark's endeavors have been extensive and varied, but his principal commitment has remained to the legal profession, in particular providing representation in matters concerning human rights, civil rights, general criminal, and capital defense. During his legal career, Mr. Clark has represented an unbelievable array and quantity of clients, a number of whom easily qualify under the definition of controversial, to say the least. Notable members of the lengthy list include Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic, deposed Yugoslavian President Slobodan Milosevic, and perhaps most notoriously, former Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. Today, Mr. Clark is going to talk to us about some of his controversial representations, his reasons for taking them on, the manner in which he approached them, and the unique ethical and practical challenges that he faced in handling these cases. In addition, I also hope that he will share with us some reflections on how he went from being the chief prosecutor for the United States to what I have characterized as the attorney for the condemned. Please join me in welcoming former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark.
Good morning. It's good to be in Dean Rusk's Hall. I was fortunate enough to spend 8 years in Kennedy and Bush administrations with Dean Rusk, and he was a very great man, modest and wise and inflexible in his commitment to the right as he saw it. He caused one little problem for our family. His wife is named Virginia. My wife's name's Georgia. And many people would start calling Georgia Virginia. And Virginia reported once in a while they started calling her Georgia. But we got it straightened out. There's a funny story about him. When he first came to the State Department in probably early January, they were introducing him around because he didn't take office till the 21st of January. Some big shot from protocol who were supposed to be, the best in diplomatic handling of matters. He's interested in introducing Dean Rusk to the principal permanent staff there, and kept calling him Dean. Dean, I'd like you to meet the chairman of our review board, which is so contrary to diplomatic procedure. But he thought that the dean stood for, it was a title. He'd been the dean or something, and very typical. Dean Rusk never corrected him. He may not even thought it was a mistake. I don't know. I'll have to start out by ethics is a narrower and thin word that a little brittle than morality. If you look back through philosophy and study it, morality is always the term that's preferred, and ethics tends to deal with something that applies to everything. That you shouldn't steal, particularly from people who trust you. You shouldn't betray people, particularly if their life may depend on it or their fortune. But to me, legal ethics has a broader meaning, and it's lawyers have an ethical or moral obligation because they are its principal support, in the trenches at least. To always act to protect, serve, and advance the rule of law. That's our basket. If you're a doctor, your principal ethics should be healing the sick. Doing everything you can to heal the sick. And if all ethics referred to is overcharging or stealing money, not that there's not a lot of that going on in the medical and legal professions, the core obligation of the people in that aspect of life, healthcare being that for the doctors and the rule of law for lawyers, could be pretty seriously neglected. I'm at least as old as I look, and I can tell you, though, that in that time that you see here, the legal profession, as we call it, has changed radically. I can remember in the mid-'50s, I wish I knew the year, but I think it was '56, and some people came running downstairs to our little office in the building. They were up on the 2 top floors from Thompson Knight, which has been the biggest firm in Dallas. And of which at the time I thought, how can you be a lawyer with with 19 lawyers. And they'd just gotten their 20th lawyer. Dick Raines, who was already a member of the firm, and I mean, they didn't call them partners and associates in those days, you just a member of the firm, but you might have been a small member, but there you were. And Dick's brother joined the firm. So I went up to the party, but I thought the whole time, this is the end. You know? We can't go on like this. Now Aiken Gump, Ted Aiken was about my age and a really nifty guy. His father I revered. His father was a great lawyer. But they had 7 or 8 lawyers, and now they've got over 1,000. And we've become a business. But if all ethics did was protect the area of conduct, the legal profession in our case, from ordinary crimes that you find out about by reading the 10 Commandments, the law wouldn't be saved. Our burden is to try to help shape the law to meet the needs of a constantly changing society in which many have few rights or few privileges that others can't, including the government itself, can't violate. Hugo Grotius, who was a student of Ibn Khaldun, who was an 11th century Muslim scholar who traveled all over the world, from the Middle East to Spain at least. That was pretty much all over the world in those days, pre-Columbus. Talked of law this way: this character preserves society, which is the source of all law. And I've tried to follow that some. I'm going to start with, I had fun as a lawyer in Texas. Good time and lots of travel, driving out to little county seats to try cases. And good people. But you couldn't get your hands on too much. And when I came to the Department of Justice, I had one thought, and that was that there's only one reason to be here, and that's to make a difference, because pay is not that good, and the hours are exhausting, and you could be doing something that would make you more money. So I wanted to try to set up something like Jeremy Bentham had, and his notion of a temple of justice that's striving to see how law, which restrains and uplifts people, can best serve. And looking at our society in the 60s, which is a particular time, to me it was the best of times. If the people aren't up, nothing very good's happening. And I'll tell you, the people who were up in the 60s, some of them were too far up, but by that I mean they were more than shaking things. You had to keep your head down. So I thought, our role in the death penalty, and particularly coming out of the South as I did in the private death-taking, lynchings, was a stark part of our history, and it was time to abolish the death penalty. I brought the Department of Justice out against the death penalty in 1965. There wasn't an execution, a federal execution, from 1963 until the Oklahoma bomber in 2001, and started talking to the states about it. And interesting, the first year in our history that there wasn't an execution was 1968, which is also a pretty wild year. It was the year of the greatest race riots by far that the country's ever seen, more than 100 locations after Dr. King's death alone. people just coming out hurting bad, you know. It wasn't anything planned. They heard he was dead, and they were hurt bad, and they just came out and started tearing the place up all over the country. I flew down to Memphis that night, coming back in the next morning. It wasn't morning, I'm sorry. I spent the day down there. I was going to go by and get Miss King, but Rockefeller had a plane here, so he brought her over to Memphis, and I picked her up at the airport about 7, and we spent a good part of the day together. The governor had already put tanks out in the streets, and they were ready to fire those cannons, if you can believe it. He was a law and order man, as they say. I came back up to Washington that night, and we were in a little jet star from Andrews Air Force Base, and we came up the Hudson, came up the Potomac. He said 12 miles. It's hard to believe, but there was smoke rolling down from our nation's capital, from race riots immediately following the death of Martin Luther King. I wanted to do something about prisons. I thought our prisons were unbearably big and unbearably cruel and unbearably destructive, because I thought more crime came out of prisons than went in, more potential to harm other people came out of prisons than went in. You're manufacturing crime by a process. And what we had then in prison is nothing like what we have now. We've got 12 times more prisoners in federal institutions. We don't even look at it. Next year we will have 3 million people in present custody in jails and prisons throughout the United States. That's almost 1% of the population. There's nothing like it around. And you visit any prison you want to and see if you think we're helping people very much with any of them. I can't find much help there. We've got to be smarter than that. And the rule of law is involved. If the rule of law doesn't address things like that, who's going to address it? And particularly for lawyers who deal with it all the time. Keep going into those miserable places and seeing what's going on. Civil rights had become a great passion of mine in the 50s. I was born and raised in Dallas, and pretty much we left when I was 9. I came back when I was for junior high school, and then came back after I finished school. But I could tell that we weren't doing right by black people. We weren't doing right by Chicanos. They didn't have, some of them were happier than we were, but they were not well off. I mean, they didn't have good food, good health care, good schools. They didn't have good nothing except their own cultures and selves. And it was breaking up because the jobs were going to the north and families were breaking up. So we worked awfully hard on civil rights, and I thought that was important. The war was tearing the country apart. And it's sad to have to say it, but it seems very clear to me now, and I thought it was a big part of the action at the time, but with Iraq and out of draft, you found very little resistance to the war in comparison, and the resistance you had wasn't of the emotional quality that you had the Vietnam War, because the draft was taking the kids from families that didn't want them to go, you know. And we didn't have to give great big bonuses. We'd give them GI pay, which not good. I mean, I got $80 a month as a corporal, and it's you know, you don't save much on that. And there was great pressure to prosecute draft resistors, who were overwhelmingly supported by their families and various preachers and baby doctors and good workers. And great pressure on me. The president was unhappy. I had a rule with the president. I would not discuss criminal cases, period. In the Spock case, he didn't find out about it until it was announced in the press. And he called me up. He said, "Ramsey, you sure fooled me on that one." I didn't think you'd do it. Benjamin Spock was a famous baby doctor, and a very good one, and a national figure, well known. And he joined with many others in what today in the terrorism field we'd call state sponsors of terrorism. He was out trying to talk students into to not going into the service. Hell no, we won't go, to burn their draft boards and cards and stuff like that. And I wanted to know we were right about the case. I was purely finally responsible for the case, which is fairly rare for an attorney general because he's too busy speaking at banquets and stuff. We just lost Thurgood Marshall, and Dean Erwin Griswold had come down from Harvard. He'd been his longest-serving dean in the history of Harvard, and a real scholar. And I sent the case over to him and said, I want to know that this case doesn't violate First Amendment rights if it's filed. The criminal division was pushing for it, and because they were really under the gun. General Hershey, who was the head of selective service, was apoplectic about the situation. And I wouldn't, he wanted, if people participated in a peace march, he wanted to accelerate their date of induction. Literally. And started out, we had a big fight about it. I'll tell you, it went all the way to the Oval Office. And I couldn't do that. You're preventing people from expressing their views and exercising rights by a threat to send them off to Vietnam, which is the thing they least want to do in the world at that time, if they do that. But anyway, he approved it, Dean Griswold. He said, I think it's a case. I think this case ought to be brought. And I'll have to say in my own right, I'd always thought that, you remember Thoreau was in jail for not paying a tax in the Mexican-American War. So he didn't like the war, he wouldn't pay the tax. And there's a story, and I don't think it's apocryphal, that Ralph Waldo Emerson came down there to see him. And came up went to the jail and said, David, what are you doing in there? And David answered out, Waldo, what are you doing out there? But as I told the judge in Boston in the case, I thought it was right that Thoreau be prosecuted for not paying his tax, but I thought it was wrong to put him in jail, because that doesn't help this country at all. But anyway, we prosecuted the case, and I sent a message to the court that I thought any penalty would be improper. The court didn't think so. He sentenced him to 2 years, I believe. The point I really wanted to make about it all, though, was the convictions came down in 68, and I went out to Chicago. My law school dean was Ed Levy, who was a brilliant antitrust scholar. One of my first ambitions was to be an antitrust lawyer because I thought you could break up industry and keep things where everybody had a chance to move up, And we filed a lot of big, not necessarily successful lawsuits. IBM, because computers are emerging, and that case lasted 15 years. I think it gave a lot of others opportunity to enter into the field. If you want diversity in any field at that time, I thought it'd be that. Took after the automobile companies, tried to make them, among other things, put emission devices into the cars as a mandatory thing because they were violating the antitrust laws by acting selectively. But these all have to do with a lawyer's duty to try to shape the law to serve society in a beneficial way. Anyway, when Dean Levy was now chancellor of the University of Chicago. I had graduated in 50. And he'd call me out. He'd call me out early. He said, they've occupied our offices, the students. And will you come out and talk to them, see if you can get them out? It was pretty bad. They'd broken into the files of professors and they'd released embarrassing letters. It was really shameful. One guy who went with the Ford Foundation later, always ashamed of things that the students found in his files. So I said, yeah, I'll come out there. I came out there. I walked through the office stepping over bodies. They hadn't had baths for 2 weeks. Food cartons all over the place. Tried to talk them out. And then he called me later and said, it's always been the tradition at the University of Chicago that the president of the university, or chancellor, as they call it, address the graduating college class. Ed was born on the campus, and it was a holy place to him. I mean, the university was like his synagogue. And he was just so down with the situation that he said, I'm not going to address the class. I said, you got to address the class. They're your student. But anyway, he asked me to address the class. So I go out there, and on the plane coming back is Benjamin Spock. And we'd never met. But I said, the first thing I want to do is relieve your mind. Dr. Spock said, I'm not a Spock baby. Mother didn't read your book. So you don't have any responsibility for me. But we became very close friends. Worked together on many projects for years and years. Bill Coffin was, he was the, what do you call him, the chaplain at Yale University. And a very distinguished guy. He'd been, I never asked him much about it, but he'd been in the World War II equivalent of the CIA. But he was a preacher through and through. I mean, in terms of character and commitment and everything else, training. And he was convicted too. So he invited me up to talk at a peace rally. And I thought, oh God, will I get out of there alive? But I did it, and I stayed in his house. And we became very good friends. One night in the late 70s, our son and his girlfriend decided to get married on Christmas Eve. They decided on Christmas Eve. So how do you get married in New York? You've got to get a license, and you've got to get a preacher and everything. So I called Bill. I asked him whether they wanted Bill or Dan Berrigan, who was a Jesuit priest and a hero in the peace movement, and they chose Bill. And on the 27th, he drove all the way down from Vermont to marry Tom and Cheryl in our living room with only the family around. It appalled the mother because he had this long thing that he's Episcopalian. The Episcopalians put on, had a big red cross and all, a rather gold cross on a red background. But the point of that is that you don't have to be enemies. That you can recognize each other's humanity. That I just got a letter from Rochelle McGee, who was accused of murdering a judge in the Marin County Courthouse shootout, which was the most expensive trial in the history of California at that time. I defended him in the case with a Minnesota University Law School lawyer from Marin County, California. It took George Jackson's brother. George Jackson was a famous soul brother, soul on fire, guy in prison, Soledad brother. George Jackson's little brother, Jonathan Jackson, had come into the courtroom. Rochelle was sitting in the seat there testifying because she had seen an assault on a guard by the defendant inmate. But he wasn't a part of it. He was a kid from Franklin County, Louisiana, that he had been unjustly convicted twice in his life, clearly, both once in Louisiana. They got him out. They didn't want him in the state. He wouldn't leave his mammy. He stayed in prison, the worst prison in the United States at that time, according to LSU University, the LSU Press book. But Rochelle wrote, "Dear old buddy," right to me. After all these years, we had a 11-1 for acquittal jury. It happened just when the golpe in Chile happened in September of '73. I left before the verdict came in. And after that, he angrily pled guilty and has been in prison ever since. He wants out now, finally. I don't know how he would live outside because he's an institution at San Quentin where he's been. But you can be friends. People were very angry that I'm the son of a judge, that I would defend a man who was accused of murdering a judge. And they had pictures of Rochelle. He hadn't done it, but they had tape, and they taped a sawed-off shotgun under Judge Haley's neck, and they'd gotten an agreement with the sheriff, who was in the same Frank Lloyd Wright courthouse in Marin County, most beautiful courthouse you ever see in the world, I think. But the San Quentin guards, their rifle range was not far away, and they decided they were going to take this on, and came through and shot and killed everybody. And we brought in 2 forensic pathologists who had done the Dag Hammarskjöld case, the father and son. One was from Johns Hopkins, one was lived in Vienna. They exhumed the body and found that the shotgun blast, which had blown off the judge's face, had not been fatal at all because there was no bleeding. And there was a bullet hole right in his heart that stopped his heart because the guards just fired into the van. They killed Jonathan Jackson. They killed Billy Christmas, who was an inmate who was cooperating with him. They critically injured the chief prosecutor, who was at the time of the trial testified as a state Supreme Court judge, which is not on the Supreme Court, but the highest trial court, and from a wheelchair, that he saw Rochelle pull the trigger and the judge's face melt away. But he didn't see that. And Rochelle really had nothing to do with it. He was just there. When I got out of the government, I decided to do things for 1 year, and I would consider this ethics, but I don't know anybody else that ever thought so. That an attorney general and people in those positions shouldn't do anything in their profession for about a year. What you find is people leave government early to get the best jobs, you know. I mean, who's going to be the new general counsel for General Motors or whatever it is, or IBM? My predecessor became general counsel for IBM. You leave in November, your term's not up. I mean, it's January 24 you're supposed to leave. And I stayed to the last day. It wasn't much fun. Richard Nixon had been elected. I even went to his inaugural because I thought continuity in government is something you ought to do. I sat behind his wife, who was quite a character, and started writing me letters. But I said, what am I going to do this year? Well, I've become a friend of the head of the government in Sweden. My wife and I went over there, and I looked at their prisons. They had about 500 people in prison, all on campuses, Uppsala and Stockholm and other places. Open door. We have a retarded daughter. We look at how they handle retarded situations. They provide homes for families and collateral support to raise the children. And my wife's into music and ballet, and she went to see their ballet. They took her down to Copenhagen, where they got a coordinated Scandinavian ballet, big one, good one. We came back here. I started teaching at Howard. I didn't think teaching would be conflict of interest. It looked like you're trying to take advantage because they didn't pay me anything. At Howard, in that semester, was really a wild place. They drove the dean out, Pat Harris, which they shouldn't have done, but that's how angry they were. And she tried too hard to hold them in line. She was later Secretary of Housing, or HEW Housing, I think. But the students were wonderful. We had the greatest classes I ever had. I taught for 4 or 5 years. Just a seminar on a course that I made up called Law as an Instrument for Social Change. How do you use law training and law to achieve social change in all walks of life? Because an unjust law is a law in name only. And it do a lot of harm. That's about what I did. I got into a whole bunch of cases right off the bat. Chile was one of them. It shows what can happen. I got a lot of calls to go down to Chile right after the golpe. A bunch of them had to do with the Air Force because they immediately arrested the Air Force people because they thought it was loyal to Allende. And the general in charge of the Air Force had been military attaché in the Chilean embassy in Washington. So he knew Washington, and he heard my name or something, and they called me. By the way, his daughter, who was in prison at that time with her mother, his two sons had fled the country, fortunately, and they stayed in prison for a year and a half, is now the president of Chile. And a very great woman in a very difficult job. I went down and agreed to try to help guide. I couldn't represent in court, obviously, the defense of all these people. The trials didn't come up till mid-spring of '74, and they had murdered the general in December. But that was the sort of thing I started doing, and pretty much doing ever since. I can't quite read these notes for other cases, but one would be pretty important. There's a case called Harrisburg 7, and this shows what gets you into things. J. Edgar Hoover had a very close rapport with the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, subcommittee, where the money comes from. And they'd get in there and he'd regale the chairman with stories. So one of the stories was that there's a priest and a nun and a group of Catholic radicals that are planning to, if you can believe this, destroy the computers at the Pentagon. They'd been engaged in draft board raids. They had a famous trial out of Baltimore. I had been the U.S. attorney for burning draft records. They'd go into a poor part of town. They'd take the draft records out. This is where black kids and others were living. And they'd burn them with napalm, symbolically, to show their protest to the war and to the draft. But this was big time, and here's Hoover telling the chairman of the subcommittee appropriations for the Department of Justice that they're planning to kidnap someone, that Henry Kissinger is on the list, and that they're planning to blow up the heating tunnels under the naval building, the new naval building which was there, the Forrestal building. Well, these people are as gentle and loving as anybody you'll see. They're also morally strong as anybody can see. A very prominent lawyer from Princeton, which doesn't have a law school, but has a lot of studies in law, came up and pleaded with me to take the case, and I drove up to Danbury where they were holding them and talked to them, took the case, and we lived the winter in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It flooded that spring. But I felt a need. People would say, well, you know, he's changing sides there. He was prosecuting these people not too long ago, and now he's defending them. I felt a very high obligation to take the case and took the case, and we won that case. I'll have to skip over cases. I've been pretty busy all these years, but now, how much time do I have?
Only about 15 minutes for questions.
I have 15 minutes? Or does that include your time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Does that include questions?
No, you have 15
Okay.
will be left for questions.
Yeah. I'll come on down to current cases. That is more current, and the ones that still upset people, but we ought to remember that at the Republican convention in Miami, Presidential Nominating Commission, in 1968, when Richard Nixon made his acceptance speech, my wife and I, we kept television out of our house till 1968. We didn't want the kids watching it all the time. We just wouldn't have it, which is a big handicap to me, it turned out, because, you know, I wasn't seeing the mayor of Saigon shoot a kid in the head in the streets there and stuff like that. I hear about it, but I didn't. If you watch it every night and it spoils your dinner, it takes a toll on you. But anyway, my wife and I sit in the basement watching TV and watching the Republican, because we're citizens, we do that sort of thing. And all of a sudden he said, and the next thing we're going to do, no, he said, the first thing we're going to do is get a new attorney general. I said, what do you say, Georgia? What do you say? I couldn't have dreamed if you say anything like that. But everybody does. You know, I hadn't planned on staying. But I had also planned on saying the first thing you're going to do. Mary McRory, who was an interesting Washington reporter for a long time there, not exactly a reporter, but columnist and whatnot, said that he made the same comment in campaign speeches more than 100 times during the campaign. It had to do with fear of crime, because I was supposed to be soft on crime, and it had to do with the fear of riots, because I told Mayor Daley that if he shot looters, he would be charged with federal crime, because we had a new civil rights law that made it a crime to use unnecessary force in a public civil rights forum. And needless to say, he got a little upset too, but I meant it. You can't shoot a looter. You arrest a looter. If you can't catch him, you better get some tennis shoes or something. You're supposed to be able to catch him or hunt him down. But you start shooting 12-year-old kids for stealing a basket of apples and stuff like that, and you're going to divide this country irreconcilably. But the anger and fear was very great, and the riots that year were very deadly, and the excessive force was staggering. The number of police who were injured or killed was absolutely minuscule. And the number of rioters that were killed, as we call them, was staggeringly high. Property damage was great. But I could take some of that, but not the killing. Anyway, afterwards, I got into a series of cases. You know, events shape these things. I never asked for a case in my life. There's some cases I wanted, but I never asked for them. But I was sitting in the office one day, and a guy in a very nifty suit came by. He was a Liberian. His name was Charles Taylor, very spiffy. And I've always worked on Haiti. I love the Haitian people. They're the poorest in the hemisphere. Their artists are powerful. Their character is unique. And their lives are miserable, really miserable. And anyway, Charles came by and said he was concerned that he might be extradited to Liberia. Sergeant Samuel K. Doe was the president of Liberia, and he's a very murderous guy. He overthrew the government and killed the president, who was a graduate of Howard University, as many. You know, that was our colony. That's where Lincoln at one time was talking about sending all the slaves. We have a long history with it. I'd probably gotten 6 or 8 prisoners out of the jail there because I felt responsibility there in the Philippines to try and do more work on violations of rights. And he wanted to pay me some money. I said, no, I don't want any money. If they try to extradite you, let me know. I'll try to help you. Well, they filed a case in Boston. And it's funny, a lawyer from Texas whose brother was dean of law school when I was down there, famous tort lawyer, the brother who was the dean, was the judge. And we appeared. Worked pretty hard on the case. We got Samuel K. Doe was a sergeant who'd overthrown the government. He came from a very small tribe, but a fierce tribe, and had a very violent government. We got film showing him throwing prisoners to alligators and thrashing in the water and stuff like that. And we're working hard, hoping to keep Charles Taylor from being sent back. Charles had gone to Brently, a little college up in Massachusetts, been president of the student body and president of the Liberian Student Association, all 3 of them. But then he became president of the National Liberian Students Association, and then he became president of the All-American Liberian Association, which is a lot of people. I don't know if it's 25, 40,000 maybe. And he'd gone back to try to help late in the Doe administration, and he saw immediately that he couldn't hack it. That it was just too dangerous and just too wild, so he came back home. And Doe decided to extradite him. Doe is the one that put telephone poles up on the beach and put all the ministers, about 11 of them, tied them on the telephone poles and let them melt down the day. And they came out in the evening and shot each one of them in the head, except the son of the president, who was shot and killed in the palace. And the son had fled, was fleeing to the French embassy, and he was shot in the street right in front. And Doe was our man in Liberia. There's a general named Kwiwonkpa who was in Aberdeen. And he was one of these generals that sleeps in the barracks with the guys, a Liberian general. The troops all loved him, but he had fled. I didn't know anything. They never tell me anything about their secret stuff. I thought if Kwiwonkpa was in Aberdeen, and he and Charles are like that, and he's a general, something must be up. Anyway, before the judge ruled, they were holding him in the Plymouth County Jail because there's no federal facility closer in the area. We've been up there several times. Got locked in one night, and Charles, he was a commanding personality. He just called it cell to cell to cell till they got the word outside. There are two lawyers back in there. Would you please let them out? So one night his wife calls Tupi. He said, Charles has escaped. And he had. Now Charles Taylor, as you know, is on trial before a court that was convened to consider crimes in Sierra Leone, which is a neighboring country. The first target of that court was Muammar Gaddafi from Libya, which is not even a neighboring state. At least Sierra Leone and Liberia border each other, and there's a lot of traffic back and forth, a lot of diamonds in Sierra Leone. But I put a team together for Charles because I may have to testify because I know a lot about his past. And people say, how can you represent that man? It's not out of the blue, and it's sure not for money. President Milosevic came about another way. I was a Marine, and I was going to fly into Belgrade in August of '46. And they'd been shooting at our planes. And so we were flying along in a little C-46, and I look out the window, and poof, poof, look over across, poof. They're shooting at us, so we go back. And finally I get in, and they were mad as hell because we had bombed Belgrade pretty heavy in 1945. We'd done it for the same reason that the Russians bombed the hell out of a lot of cities as they were coming in from the east. But the people resented, and still resent it, but not as much as the Russians, but still they didn't like to be bombed. And then my wife and I, on a belated honeymoon, went into northern Yugoslavia, Slovenia, and Croatia. The people were just dirt poor. This is 1951. It was after I finished law school. And we saw how they were living. And I'd always had the idea that the creation of Yugoslavia was a very important step to prevent war in the Balkans. It was created by the first UN, so to speak, League of Nations, after World War I, because folks felt that because of the constant violence in war, because you had the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you had all these little tiny countries with different languages, and the Balkans were a joke and a place of constant conflict. And a powerful book by Ivo Andrić on Bridge on the Drina, published by the University of Chicago, about all this history. I felt powerfully that Yugoslavia is essential to peace in the Balkans in our time. It just ought to be a little bit bigger. It ought to include Hungary, and it's a federation. It was a federation. We wanted to break it up. So did Germany. Germany was very close to Croatia and supported the Ustasi, which was a very brutal organization serving the German cause in World War II. So I went over there several times. Then we started bombing them again. The Germans didn't have any part in the new bombing because, they hadn't recovered that much from World War II yet. This is in the mid-90s. But we were bombing the daylights out of them, primarily infrastructure, vital targets, automobile plants and stuff like that. And I'd never met Milosevic. And, but they called me and said his home had been bombed. Would I like to go see it? I thought, well, yeah, I'd like to go see it, see if that looked like an assassination attempt or what it was. I went out there and boy, his home was flattened to the ground. And then they said, well, would you meet with him? I went over and met with him. And then he was later indicted by the International Criminal Court for former Yugoslavia, created by the Security Council illegally. There's nothing in the UN Charter that gives the Security Council or the General Assembly or the UN as a whole the power to create a criminal court. There never would have been a United Nations if the leading powers in San Francisco had thought they could ever be indicted by an international criminal court. There was an instrumentality of that. It was impossible, but it's a selective court. I've had dozens of cases on discriminatory selective prosecution. I hate it because it just absolutely corrupts the law. I'll choose you and you're doing worse, but we're buddies, or maybe even that. And so here we are going in to break up Yugoslavia, which breaks up my heart because I think it's essential to peace. It remains essential to peace. You go to Bosnia now and there's absolute chaos. The two biggest problems the law has to face are violence and segregation. They're the two most common, in the broadest terms, uses of government. And we broke Bosnia up into so many pieces that are so divided among adversaries that the Muslims and the Orthodox Christians and the Muslims and all are at each other. The economy is rock bottom. They're an industrious people. They've had good industry. They've lived well. They've had fine arts and all these years, and they're just impoverished and exploited by foreign economic. Anyway, there are others. Who else should I mention there? Karadzic. Karadzic became the president of what he called Srpska. Karadzic was living in Sarajevo. He'd never been in government. He was a psychiatrist, MD. I like this part. He'd studied at Columbia University for a year in poetry. And he came from a famous family. In the history books over there, his family goes back for 7, 8 generations. There's prime ministers and stuff like that. But he wasn't into it. But they needed somebody, and he took over the office. He came to the UN. He was reluctant to come to the UN in the peace negotiations. They'd been meeting in Geneva. He said, I'll go to Geneva. He refused to come to New York. They finally let him come to New York as a guest of the UN. And he was all alone there. There were a bunch of Bosnian lawyers and some in big firms in New York, and they looked all over town for people to represent him. And one guy's an extremely fine lawyer in a big firm, and he really wanted to take the case. The firm wouldn't let him. So I took the case. And this was a case they threw papers at him. He had 20 UN guards and some process server threw papers at him. The UN wouldn't provide immunity, and we had a big lawsuit about it, which is an absurd lawsuit for trying to hold him responsible for Srebrenica, which he'd never even heard of, and many other things. Now he's about to begin trial. Richard Holbrooke apparently promised him he would not be prosecuted if he resigned. He resigned. 2 high officials in the U.S. administration at that time say it's true, the promise was made. And the ICTY just last week said no immunity and the trial will go forward in November. I'll see him next week, in a week or so, and I took him over a big stack of poetry books, which he enjoyed. Now, I'll come to Saddam Hussein. I'll take a couple of minutes. I first met Saddam Hussein in 1990. I'd been in Yugoslavia, but I'm sorry, I've been in Iraq, but I had no need or interest in seeing him. You waste more time protocol meetings than you do anything else in this kind of business. But his ambassador in Washington called and said, would you come see him? And I would not have said no. I mean, you'd have had to restrain me because it was, you had to put sanctions on in September of 90, and he had invaded Kuwait. He'd started the Iran-Iraq War, which was a terrible mistake, a tragic mistake. 100 to 200,000 young Iraqis and 800 or 900,000 young Iranians lost their lives in that war. But he said he'd like to see me. Turned out he was asking Gorbachev, who went. He asked Mitterrand from France, who went, and others. And you come in and you talk for an hour or so, and all he'd say is, I don't want war. Who would? He was no fool. He knew he'd get blasted off the map. He said, surely we can work this out. I'm calling people from around the world to try to work this out. Let's try and resolve it. I'm desperate. Well, the war started. I went over there the second week of the war and drove up and down a couple of thousand miles from north to south looking at bombing. Watched high-flying U.S. bombs drop bombs in Basra. We saw the bombs come right down the Shatt al-Arab, which is where the Tigris and the Euphrates come together going into the Gulf of Arabia, and hit the training hospital. Only there was no electricity. There was no generally generated electricity for the public within 12 hours after the bombing started anywhere. But they had gasoline generators for emergency purposes in hospitals and places. Saw those lights go out. Raced down there. Then the sanctions, UN sanctions on Iraq, according to the UNICEF, World Food Program, Food and Agriculture Organization, 3 major UN organizations talking about the sanctions, all said they're killing children. UNICEF came out in August of 91 and said the sanctions are the direct cause of the death of at least 75,000 children. The head of the Red Crescent had told me it's worse than that, about what's happening to the children. Just rehydration. There's no good drinking water. You know? And little babies and little children get bad drinking water. A rehydration tablet will save their lives like that. No rehydration tablets. You just down the drain in 48 hours, your baby's gone. Finally, they came to a figure of food and agriculture after a major survey. It said 575,000 children under the age of 5 have died as a direct result of UN sanctions. Now, is that good law? Is that acceptable? I'd even go so far as to say, is that genocide? I met him 2 or 3 times. He'd talk forever, and he'd listen forever. Most leaders don't listen. They want you to hear what they say, and it doesn't matter much what you say as long as it's yes. He used 3 translators. I'd never seen one of these big shots use but 1 translator. And the translators would argue among each other as to what was actually said, because he wanted to be sure he really understood what was said. And he said some pretty wise things. We talked about how it was that Johnson could be so passionate on human rights as he was, on civil rights. You know, I've lived most of my life in that field, and the African-American meetings, they'd cry. But he taught school in down in South Texas, Cotulla. And the little children, Mexican children, didn't have shoes. And while he was president, he'd cry when that happened. And when it came to Vietnam, another coonskin on the wall. And if we lost a bunch of planes at night, he'd go to the Situation Room at 3 o'clock in the morning and see how many planes we lost. And you didn't want to talk to him if we lost a bunch of planes that day, because he'd be mad. And Saddam Hussein said, in our tradition, we have a saying that a prophet is a person who can love at a distance. After he was arrested, he started calling through his family and asked me to come, and only physical restraint could have prevented me from going. The trial was an outrageous trial. It couldn't have been fair. We had 3 defense lawyers killed. The appointed lawyers weren't killed. the lawyers who volunteered to come in were the ones that were killed, which makes you not sure about who the appointed lawyers really were. But the trial was a complete fraud. It was about an assassination attempt on Saddam Hussein in 1982, when they were beginning to lose the Iran-Iraq war, by a Dawa party. There's an assassination attempt in a little town called New Jail, which is about 75 miles northeast of Baghdad. And they came in this big shooting in his car. Well, what happens is they clamp down, they arrest a bunch of people. There are 2 years of legal processing under, they're using the French civil system of law there, investigating. And they come up with 140 confessions. A lot of people fled back to Iran. The Iranian border is not 80 miles from New Jail, got away. They tried to assassinate Tariq Aziz and other leaders at the same time, this Dujail party, who were the first 2 prime ministers of the new government, but Aliki and Maliki, and they're both Dujail party people. The party's based in, we couldn't investigate. It'd take an armored division to take us to Dujail to talk to people, and people all leave before we got there. So I'm going to have to stop at that. And they changed the judge 3 times. This is the last important thing. The first judge seemed moderately favorable. He condemned the judgment after. They removed him. The second judge never got started. They said, he's not satisfactory. They brought a judge who hadn't heard more than half of the evidence, because more than half the trial was over, from Kurdistan, who was born and raised in Halabja, which is the most famous town in Kurdistan, destroyed during the Iran-Iraq war by gas. He lost family, he lost relatives. And then you all saw the execution. Here's Saddam Hussein standing there with a rope around his neck, seconds before he dies. He's looking at these people from the Dujail party heckling him, and he asks, is this the way Iraqi men act? We can't take things for granted about who's good and who's evil. Thank you.
We've got about 3 minutes. We can go over a little bit, but if there are a few questions, Mr. Clark would be happy to entertain a question or two. Then we'll have to move on to our next panel. But if you do have a question, please step to the microphone in the rear of the room.
I may not be happy to answer them, but I'll answer them if I can. You want a point? You want me to?
Well, if you'll repeat the question. Go ahead. But you have to repeat.
You mentioned 1% of the population roughly is in prison in the United States, and that's higher than I think any other country by far.
Yeah.
I know in the federal system, most of the people are in there on drug-related charges. I'm not sure what the percentage is for the states, but do you have any thoughts about a better way to deal with drugs in general, recreational drugs?
Can you tell me what he said? My hearing's not too good. My hearing aid this morning started making a funny noise. Did you get the question?
I got most of it.
Yeah.
I'll do my best to repeat it. It's generally the population of the prison. We have such a large prison population, and he was saying that primarily we have drug-related offenses that are the reason why individuals are in prison. And what can we do to address the situation to reduce the overcrowding in the prisons and deal with those?
Deal with the problem differently. How
Yeah.
do you approach it?
Well, it's the fear of crime that, and the fear of terrorism, and the fear that causes you to do so many of these crazy things. A little courage would help. There's also a big industry out there. I refused to authorize any new federal prisons when I was in office. It failed only twice. Robert Byrd overrode me in Virginia, and Chavez, who was a senior U.S. Senator at the time, not Chavez, but from the old guy from Arizona, put up terrible places where they'd bring kids to West Virginia and the desert of Arizona from Los Angeles and San Diego and Pittsburgh and Baltimore. We simply have to come to grips with it. The Attica Prison Rebellion, I spent 2 years up there fighting it, bloodiest day on American soil at that time, they claimed, since the Civil War, was over prison conditions. And we had about 12,000 prisoners in prison in New York at that time. It was 1971. And the prison population in New York's going down about 20,000 now. It was up close to 90,000. It's down now about 60,000. It just keeps mushrooming. You have to, it's law. And lawyers have to organize, and they have to look at it, and they have to alter. We're just getting rid of the Rockefeller drug law in New York, just getting rid of it, which is a 15-year mandatory minimum. Crazy stuff. Some poor kid might become president or something someday, you know, but he got busted, and away he goes for 15 years. I'll tell you, you spend 15 years in a prison, and you have to be an awfully strong human being to come out with much humanity left in you. There's no magic formula. You've got to start working with legislators and organizations. The Bar Association has a big responsibility. The committees can start looking at it. But it's shameful. There are two things we do that are absolutely shameful and contrary to everything we say we believe in. Freedom and all these prisoners. Peace. And we spend more on the military than the rest of the world combined. We threaten to attack Iran when we are spending more in developing new generations of nuclear weapons than it could ever dream of. And, you know, if you're a little guy and there's a big guy, mean guy next door, and he's got a sawed-off shotgun and a .45 caliber Colt service pistol and all the rest, and all you got's a fly swatter, and you love your family, you may decide to get a gun, even though you don't like them. The reason Ali Bhutto was murdered in Pakistan, and I know this, a great president, graduate from the University of California at Berkeley, ran for the student body there, also a graduate from Oxford. He was murdered because he was insisting upon developing a nuclear weapon, and he hated nuclear weapons. But he said, my country can't survive. India has one now. There are other enemies developing them. If we don't have them, we'll be gone. So I think that, you know, the problem is there are more lawyers representing those companies than there are representing anybody else. But as professionals, if we are, we can try to make people see the light and do something about prisons in America. What an awful contradiction that the land of the free and the home of the brave would have so darn many people in prison and not even recognize it, you know. 1 out of 10 in the population would be, 1 in 100, I'm sorry.
Thank you. We're going to have to move on, so please join me again, and thank you, Ramsey.